Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first Spotlight Series event of the year, Global Food Security and How We Feed Each Other. My name is Kristen Brogdon. I'm the Director of Artistic and Community Programs here at Northrop. For access purposes, I'll let you know that I am a white woman with a blonde ponytail, and I'm wearing a black dress and a shell necklace today. The University of Minnesota Spotlight Series is a collaborative partnership of the Institute for Advanced Study, the University Honors Program, and Northrop to present lectures, panel discussions, exhibits, and other events throughout the academic year around timely topics of interest. The six-part 2022-23 series will focus on how data, their collection, analysis, and the research questions that rely on them connect to the deeply personal lived experiences of individual human beings and to the human condition at large. Today's event is presented in partnership with the Institute on the Environment. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that whether you're here on campus or with us online, we are all located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus resides on Dakota land, ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. We acknowledge this place has a complex and layered history. This land acknowledgement is one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about this land and our relationships with it and each other. The IAS, Northrop, and University Honors Program are committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. I'd also like to offer the words of our panelist today, Valentine Cadieux, who notes the following in relationship to our land acknowledgement. Our efforts to investigate what lies beneath the narratives of feeding that are associated with corn can be put in relationship with our honoring the pre-colonial history of corn in this place and our efforts to be accountable to the feeding role of that corn and its relatives. Thank you, Valentine. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's guests. Deepak Ray is a senior research scientist in global landscapes at the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment. Dr. Ray conducts research on global food security and how climate change already impacts crop yields. To do this, he builds high-resolution global statistics to understand crop productivity trends. His analysis is geared to support NGOs, industries, international organizations, and governments so that they can make more informed policies and overcome challenges together. Valentine Cadieux is a professor of environmental studies and anthropology and the director of the Center for Justice and Law at Hamline University. She is grateful to be in community with a circle of learners and organizers growing and sharing food in the Twin Cities, in the Urban Farm and Garden Alliance, the Twin Cities Community Agricultural Land Trust, the Minnesota Agrarian Commons, and other interwoven circles. Valentine is focused on mending, especially in spaces of urban community economic resistance, reimagination, and repair of land relationships. Please help me welcome our esteemed panelists. Before we get much further into the program, I want to offer a few technical instructions for our audience members. We do have a captioner working with us today. Our online viewers can enable captions by clicking on the closed caption or live transcription button, commonly located in the bottom Zoom menu bar if you're on a desktop computer, or in the top right menu if you are on a mobile device. Then select Show Subtitles. We will be using Slido to facilitate our audience Q&A today. You can submit questions anytime during our program. Attendees can use their smartphones and either scan the QR code displayed on screen or go to www.slido.com and enter the code Spotlight Series. Zoom attendees, check the chat for a direct link to our Slido page. Please note that questions can be submitted anonymously and do have a 160-character limit. We encourage you to upvote previously submitted questions to ensure we address questions based on audience interest priority. And now, without further delay, our moderator for today and for the Spotlight Series is Michael Corey. Michael is the Geospatial Technical and Data Lead and Associate Director for Mapping Prejudice, which uses crowdsourcing to identify racially restrictive housing covenants on properties in Minnesota and beyond. Before transitioning to public history, he spent 20 years as a data journalist, including at the Star Tribune and the Center for Investigative Reporting. Michael is also currently a graduate student in the University of Minnesota's Heritage Studies and Public History program. Thanks, Michael. Take it away.
Can you hear me? There we go. Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you, Kristen. Thank you so much to IAS, Northrop, and the University Honors Program for hosting all of us today. And of course, thank you to our two panelists for being here today and for all of the prep work we've already put you through. So I'm excited to have this conversation. And for you all, we're going to go in a couple different directions today. We're going to talk about food security and at the worldwide and at the local level. But the theme of this year's Spotlight series is the human and the data, and we want to talk about that at a little bit more of a meta level too. So I think maybe it'll be what you thought you were going to hear, and maybe not. I'm not sure, but we're going to talk about what are we counting, what's represented by that data, what does that data leave out, and how does what we count shape our understanding both of what's going on and what we might do with that data. But let's start with some really basic but really big questions. And so for each of you, what is food security? What's your definition of food security? Deepak.
All right, yeah, I will start. There are 4 different dimensions of food security around the world. And nowadays there's more, 2 more dimensions are catching up. So the first is like having the availability of the food. So that does not mean just like the food in your store, but farmers harvesting the crops. So that is the availability of the food. And my work is almost entirely concentrated on whether we have that availability all across the world. Once you have that availability, you also need to be able to acquire that food. So you need to be able to go and get that food, and you need to be able to use that food and use it in your family. All the members get enough food. And if this happens only like half the year, and the rest half the year you don't have the availability, you can't get and acquire it, or you can't utilize it, then you don't have the stability. So that stability aspect is also important. You need to have it throughout the year. And what is catching up more recently is the agency part and the sustainability part. So the agency is like culturally relevant food. So like if your cultural relevance for food is like to eat rice and you get lots of bread, that's no good. So that aspect. And also the sustainability, which I addressed a little bit, like if climate change reduces your food production, then there is a sustainability issue over there. So these are all the 6 dimensions of food security. And there could be more, I don't know then, because I concentrate mostly on the first one.
And Valentine, do you have your own definition you want to put forward?
Sure, yeah, I think that 6-part framework really makes a lot of sense. I think at the moment we can see, for example, like things like war really affect availability. You can see that stability. And you can see, for example, in migration, that people's agency, in addition to all those other framework components, gets disrupted. So there are, I think, 2 potentially useful, they're not exactly food security, but they get used along with this, 2 frameworks of food sovereignty and food justice. And really what people mean when they talk about this is food security in context. So I think historically we've often heard of food security as a charitable effort, and people who talk about food sovereignty argue access to basic food security is one of the rights that's been signed onto in the Declaration of Human Rights for many decades by almost all governments. Real food security that people had agency and that was sustainability would also include people being able to be participants in the food system. So 2 really good examples of this are, if you wanted to participate in the food system on your own terms, being able to be a farmer or to work in food chain work and to be included in the National Labor Relations Act in the US. So those are 2 carve-outs. People who work in restaurants and people who work in farms don't get paid minimum wage. So I think we've seen this. I think it's a lot clearer during COVID how much those are vulnerable components of the world food security system. But I think it's also really easy to overlook because it's so assumed this is just the way it works.
Well, and given these two definitions, do we have a food security crisis in either of these or both of these dimensions? So I don't know, do you want to keep talking?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that we see over the last few years, so in theory, food security, hunger is considered to be the world's largest solvable problem. And we saw this with the UN Development Goals. We see it pretty repeatedly. People are like, cool, we will be able to extinguish hunger by this date. And it keeps getting worse. And I just came back, I spent the spring in Europe. We were never able to buy flour. And flour is a staple food for many people. So some of these questions of, can people afford to buy food at all? And can we continue to eat the foods that we know how to use? We're not seeing progress in those areas particularly.
Deepak, what would you say? How would you define our food security crisis?
So when in 2015 the world came together to eradicate food security problems, like nobody will be hungry by 2030, the UN Sustainable Development Goal, which is number 2, food security for all, around 1 in 10 were undernourished or they had some hunger issues. And we are now in 2022, still have 1 in 10. Projection is by 2030, still have 1 in 10. So, I mean, no progress taking place. And much of these calculations were done prior to the Ukraine-Russian Federation war. And the lingering effects of COVID are still not very, very clear. So approximately 800 plus million, or twice the population of the United States, are undernourished around the world. Most of them in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia, but some in other places of the world as well. Haiti, for example. So one way to overcome food insecurity is to give people the purchasing power. So that's why the Sustainable Development Goal number 1 is actually to eliminate poverty. So poverty and food security are very closely linked together. But as far as the condition right now, we have more than twice the population of the United States. That's the size of the population who have hunger around the world.
All right, well, I think we've laid out sort of what are we talking about. So I think each of you want to do a brief presentation about some of your work and how it connects to these. So I think Deepak, why don't you go first?
Okay, I'll just stand up and make it short. Okay, so this first slide, it shows how we do agriculture around the world. The top one is how we do it in the Midwest with big combines and monoculture, vast acres of the same crop. At the bottom one is like how it looks like, say, in India, in southern India, paddy fields, their houses, even their electricity poles, coconut palms, and whatnot. So that is how complicated different places of the world are. And if you want to talk about global food security, you cannot just talk about the Midwest, you have to talk about all across the world. So, next slide, please. So, to understand spatially how food security is all across the world, you first need to be able to measure it, right? And to measure it, you need some high resolution data. So next slide, please. So for a long time, and thankfully, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization began to track crops, production, yield, harvested area at the country level. So you can use that and you can come up with some estimates. So United States will be 1 point, but does that mean anything? Like a number for the whole of United States, a huge country. And same like Russian Federation, it's a massive country, 7 or 9 time zones. So if these are, you can track it at 250 jurisdictions or countries of the world, but if you really want to get a spatial understanding, you need to do it a little bit better than just the national level. And I would say like 95% of the publications and all use the national level numbers to come up, to calculate food security or any aspect of agriculture, because it is available for free and it is vetted by the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, so people believe in it and they have reasons to then use it. So it's easy to use and it's vetted. But if you want to do a better job, what is happening in Minnesota, then you have to do 1 level down below the national level. So next slide, please. So you can then suddenly have a problem of collecting data for 250 jurisdictions or administrative units to now 3,500 jurisdictions. And that data is not available for free or in any one place. You have to do it yourself. So you can immediately understand the degree of difficulty has jumped up. But then look at Minnesota. Minnesota is bigger than many countries of the world. So then should we just do a calculation for Minnesota? That still doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't make, you can analyze it, but you need to do even better if you want to talk about like what is really happening to make an effect on the ground level policy. So next slide, please. So if you do it at the county level of the world, you suddenly have jumped up to like almost 50,000 jurisdictions for which you have to yourself collect all the data and make sure it makes sense, correct all the data from that raw data, and then do the scientific analysis and publish the papers. So after working for many years, I have been able to successfully track only 20,000 jurisdictions of the world. So next slide, please. If suppose we were tracking like the 150 major crops of the world and study the crops for a long time, then this is the amount of data you will have to collect on your own. And how do you collect it? You go to Brazil, you say, please give me the data. I want to analyze Brazil, China, please give me the data, and so on for every country of the world, and go and join and add them, aggregate them, map them, rasterize them, and analyze them. So that will be like 750 million data points which you will have to collect. So it's pretty inhuman kind of thing to do it. Next slide, please. So that amount of data collection, I will argue, is better, but it still does not really connect us with like the human. The human is like the parcels, the farmer's parcel, but that data is impossible to get, I'll tell you, because that is now bumping against privacy issues and and competition issues between so those are privileged information. So you bump up against that, and what you would ideally want to do is know the food security at the household level. So there is a gap now between an abstract one, which is high resolution and answer, which I will show you in the next 2 slides, and then the actual one, which is the household. And you are not able to bridge it yet, and we are struggling even today how to bridge it. So next slide, please. This is like, why do we really harvest a crop? So suppose I collected all the data, and now I want to answer the question. Why do we really harvest a crop? Why do we harvest crops in the Midwest? Why do we harvest crops in Africa? So the same crop, like corn, its use has changed over time. In the 1960s, corn in the United States was primarily for feed or export, a little bit for food. But now, you know it very well, it is not just for feed, it is for industrial use, ethanol production. It is also converted into animal feed, so it's processed into high fructose corn syrup, but still exported, still some feed use. So if you just study, which I did, 10 crops, 20,000 units, and then try to see like where is the world going towards answering that reason. Why are you harvesting your lands, the crops? So next slide, please. This is what you find. It's a little bit complicated, but first of all, Africa, most of Africa is green. That means in African countries, you mostly harvest crops because you want to use it as food. So that is like, think about it like you plucked the apple from the tree and you ate it, did nothing with it. That's like food crops. But then if you go like to, say, China, China has got lots of blue colors now. That means they are harvesting the crops to use it as animal feed nowadays. It used to be different in the past. And this is my projection by 2030, why you will be harvesting it. So the world is on a certain trajectory, and this is where it will reach. You go to like Russian Federation and Ukraine, what colors do you see? It is mostly like brownish, reddish colors. Is there any surprise that when the wars, the brownish, reddish colors are for exports? They harvest most of their lands and crops to export their grains. And that is the trajectory at which they are going. The United States is all these magenta, reddish colors. So magenta means for processing use. You take the soybean, you crack it open, take the oil, take the protein, send the protein over to animal feed. oil to something else. So that's like a processing use. And then you have the red colors, which is still not popping up very well, but you're in a massive ramp up for industrial use, ethanol production in the United States, Brazil, India. In Europe, you have biodiesel production and other industrial uses. And then, so suppose the world became like this by 2030, and now you have a projection of 800 plus million people who will be food insecure. So think about a situation, there's an embargo, and every country is now trying to be food secure on its own. Then how does the picture look? Next slide, please. The green colors are countries who harvest enough calories. They may use their calories in different ways, but suppose they use their calories just as food. We cannot use that yellow corn as food, I know, but suppose you used it. Then United States is all fine in green. But sub-Saharan African countries, orange and red, they can either not feed their growth in their population, or they cannot feed their undernourished or food insecure people, or both. So that is the entire sub-Saharan Africa, and also some other countries of the world. So I'd like to leave you with this, but remember, still not being able to bridge the gap. This is just country level blocks. This is not household food insecurity. There are people within that country who are insecure. So this is still very abstract, but probably good for a first step, starting point. And one more point, the calculations is based on what is known as average dietary energy requirements. Like if you're an average person, some use little bits of work, then you need 2,361 kilocalories per day. An apple is like 100 kilocalories, so you need to eat 24 apples and you will be fine. All right, so that is the requirement. I think this is my last slide. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And so Deepak is just showing us. So Deepak has just shown us his really groundbreaking work trying to answer some of these questions about agriculture and food security from, I was going to say a 30,000-foot view, but the whole point is to try to get down to a 15,000-foot view, 1,000-foot view. And so now we're going to hear from Valentine on bringing the human view, the human picture into view. So thank you.
Fabulous, thank you. And I want to say at the start, I'm a geographer, but I do not have the superhero mapping skills and data skills. So I have a lot of respect to this. And really part of the perspective I'm bringing in, the area of geography I work in is political agroecology. So what are some of the political economy questions around the agroecosystems we build? And a lot of these questions are really inflected by feminist like science and technology studies questions. So why does it matter what we can measure? And what are some of the challenges as we think about how could we measure this better to better serve people's food security needs? So I wanted to start us out with 3 of these challenges. One is that the majority of the world's hungry people are either agriculturalists or recently displaced agriculturalists. And that is true also in the US. I think we see it, some of the places where it's been best studied and best intervened in are in Brazil, where massive efforts to buy vegetables from people who live in urban peripheries to support hunger relief efforts within cities have helped staunch rural to urban migration and kind of have allowed us to see how much that displacement from people's relationship with land is part of hunger. But we see this, there's been a real surge of research at the university level and at metro regional colleges around where we are now. Up to 70% of our students are food insecure. And many of those are people whose families are from agricultural backgrounds. And not just migrants. Many people in Minnesota have lost their farms over the recent memory, people who are alive. Another fact that is a difficult one to put hard data under, but that it's estimated between 50 and 70% of the world's food, everyday consumption food, comes from informal sources that don't make it into market economies. So part of what Deepak has laid out really well for us is the way that there are different uses that we harvest food that would be accounted for by states. Those are mostly domains in which people would pay taxes on those agricultural commodities that enter markets. So there are a lot of reasons that people wouldn't necessarily report what they were eating. So wild foods, foods grown in the peripheries of megacities and exchanged in informal markets. And so that adds massive complications, and a lot of conversations that I know I've been part of here at the U of M have been about, well, if we could measure that better, who would benefit? And there were a lot of concerns, for example, when Walmart wanted to come into India and say, well, we could fix your hunger problems, but we would need all your data sets, and we would need a lot of really good deals for our distribution centers. And India is a place that has a lot of supply chain management and keeps a lot of people employed to try to address hunger. So there are some questions of political economy here. And the third point that I think is worth keeping in mind is that commodity export-oriented agriculture and the kinds of agriculture that we tend to see as efficient and modern are often characterized in the social sciences as having a problem of technology treadmill. There is a price-cost squeeze associated with this. So in order to stay in business, you have to produce more and more. As you efficiently produce more and more, you basically get paid less per unit, and you're on an accelerating treadmill because you need to be able to stay in business. So we're so masterful at processing because that's a way to keep farmers in business. And and this varies across places. The EU, in contrast to the US, has much more of a supply chain management approach to agricultural supports. So they're trying to create value chains that lead to having some more of these food security components across the board, including sustainability somewhat more markedly. So I have a picture. Next slide, please. I would like to cite Z. Akhmedova and Public Art St. Paul. So one of the projects we're working on here in the Twin Cities is a review of policies and how the policies are supporting local agriculture, and particularly within the cities. And Z is working with us to create an illustrated zine of some of the components. And one of the illustrations that has just come in last week was this distinction between commercial and non-commercial agriculture. So a commodity cucumber versus a bag of cucumbers that was left in a locker room. And I think this is really nice. It just allows us all to think about what that formal and informal food circuits look like and how they're different in a lot of ways. And it's not to say one is necessarily better than the other. They both have components that are awesome and also challenging, especially from a data perspective. Next slide. So when we think about agricultural displacement, I think it's also important to understand who gets displaced. And in the US, the Black farmland loss is a really important thing for people to know about, and to know that this is significantly part of what has shaped our map. We've been talking a lot about the Mapping Prejudice project and setting this panel up, but this is not absolute acres, this is percentage of ownership. And so from a point of some parity, even after, kind of in the height of Jim Crow and post restoration and efforts to equalize, the promises of 40 acres and a mule, Black farmland loss has continued to the present really at an accelerated rate. And we've seen this, for those of you who follow agricultural politics, in the American Rescue Act. There was a provision to forgive COVID-era debt through the Farm Service Agency for BIPOC farmers, partly based on demonstrated history of loan discrimination. And that loan forgiveness was held up by 6 states who sued for racial discrimination, to say that all farmers needed to have that if farmers who were marginalized because of race were going to get that. So that held up for 2 years. People didn't know whether they had to pay back loans. And credit is really important in agriculture because of its seasonality. So we can see the way that some of this background is also going to make people perhaps more resistant to share some of the data of what they own and what they produce, because their lived experience is that people will take it away from them if they tell people about it. So next slide. Food security is also super intergenerational. And I just kind of thinking about this, I think it's really important to acknowledge how that displacement of farmers in the rural areas of the country, but also of many parts of the world, is disproportionately borne by certain populations. So next slide, just zooming in, this is the population dot map. And part of what you see is how white rural areas in the US are, which has not always been the case. And the next slide zooms in to our region. And it allows us to see, so from a perspective of global food security, even though what I said about the importance of the foods that are grown in megacities might make sense in other places, I think it's easy to discount the food security of urban areas. But when you look at who lives where, so the blue dots are people of Asian ancestry, for example. East St. Paul has tremendously low infrastructure to serve agriculture, particularly. Ramsey County is the only state that doesn't have an agricultural extension agent, for example. We tend to define agriculture in Minnesota as requiring 10 acres or more of contiguous cropland. And so we've defined out a lot of people, many of whom migrated to Minnesota in rural areas and moved because of racism into urban areas. And so there's this very interesting, I think, in the wake of the uprisings after the murder of George Floyd, there was a lot of interest in how people feed each other. There was a lot of resurgence of informal community centers and food distributions, but there's also a lot of flight from commercial agriculture to people feeding elders and feeding on the informal market. And I think there's a lot of interest. So Ramsey County, for example, said during COVID, we want to make sure everybody who has the capacity to grow food can grow food. And that was one of their top 10 goals during COVID. And they were able to collect data on progress in the other 9 areas. And that was an area that they didn't make progress on. So some of those questions are data questions, and some are information management, and some are land management. So a lot of it comes down to what would be the data that insurers and people who are afraid of liability, that it was worthwhile to let people use land, because we're not a land poor area. We have a lot of land. So a lot of my work, last slide, is really about a dance between the kinds of data collection that would be meaningful to people and the kinds of data collection we need to help create supply chains that feed people. So we're one more stop on, this is another piece by the same artist, Zia Akhmetova. They did interviews with people, and they've been putting these murals up on community gardens in the Twin Cities. And Mary Fields, who is one of the elders of the Urban Farm and Garden Alliance, she has a small garden. It's about the size of 2 of our chairs. And when asked about why this garden was important to her, this is something that really blew my mind. I had not thought of it this way. It wasn't about the number of calories she could produce or even the amount of food. It was that she could produce greens and herbs that made the low quality produce that were available to her in the Rondo neighborhood palatable to her children and grandchildren. And that idea that there's this coefficient of palatability that agency over some tiny piece of land gives you to increase that utilization component of food security it really reinforced my interest in how do we get data that people are willing to share and make them feel like they can be part of the data process. So, and I lied, I do have one last slide. The last slide is, it's a rubric that's used by the Department of Agriculture here in Minnesota, and it was created out of about 10 years of advocacy by the Minnesotans of African descent advocacy group at the legislature to support urban agriculture at the rate that they support other forms of agriculture. And this is just an excerpt, but I think it really helps illustrate some of the measurements that people are excited about and that help them make sense of their own agroecological experience and what are the practices that they use. So for example, youth education, economic justice, ecological integrity. These are things that we don't usually name in relation to agriculture, and they're not easy to measure. And it's, I think, a really interesting question of what kinds of measurements could we ask people to do to have an easy checkbox like this. It's like, yeah, we're not using pesticides in our garden. We are working with youth that would more regularly line up resources to help support these efforts. So that household food security assessment is something that we could track as easily as we track where is flour or corn available in the world.
All right, thank you so much. So we're gonna start on the question and answer period where I get to ask some questions first, and you will all get a chance, as we mentioned earlier, to ask questions later. So if you do have questions, I don't know if I bet the QR code can come up again at some point, but I'm going to get your questions coming in on this iPad here. So when we get to the user questions, I will be reading them off of here. So be thinking of questions now, and feel free to put them in the queue now, like so we're ready to go. So I want to start. I'm gonna sort of zoom back out to some basics, just so I think we're on the same page about what we're talking about. Deepak, can you talk about, like, you spent so much time and effort creating this data set, and like and we know not everything. No, we can't touch every place in the world with this data. But can you talk a little bit about, like, how do you see the data that has been assembled? What's the work that it can do right now? Like, what do we do with it?
The first question that I answered when I started building this data was this controversy which was going on. This was like 2010s, and the seed companies were saying, like, we are generating seeds which can feed the world, and there will be no food security problem. On the other hand, agroecologists were pointing out from different areas of the world, like, say, for example, parts of China and other places, that the crop productivity had already plateaued. So they were not discussing. One was saying no problem, and one was saying there is a problem, and who is correct? There was no way to settle that debate until you did an analysis at that higher resolution to figure out what is the condition of these crop yield trends. So that is the first question that I tried to answer. And then I answered the question of, like, what will happen by 2050 then? Are we on track to feed everybody? It turns out just for wheat, if you want to double the production in wheat, you need almost 2/3 the size of Texas, that amount of land, just to grow wheat. If people eat wheat, there is that agency issue. Nobody wants to eat so much wheat. But suppose you wanted to eat, because the population was growing, and that number also has been shifting all across the time. When I started first, we talked about there will be 9.1 billion people by 2050. Then it became 9.3, 9.5, 9.8. Now it's supposed to be almost 10 billion, and it does not end in 2050. It keeps going up till 2100. So the other questions you can answer is, like, what is the effect of, like, the climate change effect on our current crop production, and how that feeds into food security aspect, and what is the effect of extreme events like we have floods or droughts, and what is it may seem like, okay, crops will get washed away by floods, or they will be stunted, but how much? And how is it happening? And will it become more frequent in the future? And will they all get correlated? So Russian Federation is a breadbasket, supposedly, and the Midwest is a breadbasket. The North China Plains is a breadbasket. And what if all of them are hit by a drought at the same time? What is the probability of such events? So you can answer all these questions only when you have a historical data set, which is long-term, high resolution enough, so that you can actually pin down to the location where actually the weather changes. Because there is no weather of the United States. There's many, many weathers of the United States. Even Minnesota, Northeast, is different from the southern part. So you have to look at it every pixel by pixel to come up to, like, the answer. So these are the kinds of questions you can answer.
And so I asked both of you as we were preparing for this, like, kind of, well, this is the first of its kind, like, as comprehensive as we can get data set. How much is not counted by this? Is there any way to know how much of the world's agricultural food is not counted by this? And I thought this was super interesting. That when I asked Deepak, and I'm sorry, and as you said, like, we're not doing a literature review here. This is not about the individual number, but you said, I think we're probably capturing within a few percentage points of most of the calories produced in agriculture in the world. And you answered the same question by saying, we might be missing 50 to 70% of global food. And I think this is totally fascinating, not because either of these numbers are wrong. These numbers are probably both correct. But I think, like, they sound so different, like, and they have such different implications. So I want to spend some time just talking about like what's important about counting in these different ways. Like what is the difference between those two numbers mean to you, first of all?
Well, one of the things that really struck me when I first started working in this area was this challenge, which is that you can't, like, you can project what someone's average needs are, but you can't tell if they've been underfed for generations. So that, you know, like, basically the measure of food adequacy remains stunting. And part of what we're learning as we learn more about epigenetics is that stunting might not just be about people reaching their full height and physical development or, you know, mental capacity. That may be, you know, we see effects from famine years on children and grandchildren. So I think one of the questions that we rarely ask is, do you have enough food? And one of the things that was really interesting when we started to ask this, for example, at college campuses, is everyone is socialized to say, well, someone else needs it more than I do. So when we first tried to give food away on college campuses, we were finding that no one would take the food because although they were not eating more than one meal a day, we were like, you're going in deeply into debt for something that requires a higher caloric load than you have. Like, please take this food. They needed to be reassured that other people had more or had enough first. So I think this question of agency in the food system relates to a question of agency in the data systems. Like, can we find some collaborative ways to ask people whether they are experiencing hunger?
Can we talk a little bit about like why calories? Why is calorie a number that that's important as opposed to like food per se? Like they're both important numbers.
Right. So from a food security perspective, you need to start with the macronutrients. So that is kilocalories, energy, and then the fat and the protein, and then you have the other things. And the agency part, that is important. But first we need to overcome the people without enough calories. In the US, there may be some groups, folks not getting enough nutrition. I give it. But at the global scale, as I said before, they are almost the size of 2 United States. That amount of people who are food insecure, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in other places of the world. So they may not like the food, but what is the other option? There is no food, there is no calories. So that's what everybody is trying to work hard for. And unfortunately, COVID and this war in Ukraine made a situation which was not that good, worse. And as I showed in my calculations, those calculations assume 600 some million people will be food insecure by 2030, but the projections are 200 million more. So half the population of the United States currently has been tacked on to like food insecure group. Yeah.
And so one way to obviously attack these problems is increasing the production of calories, but like it's not that simple, right? I mean, so like how are calories being used? You mentioned like calories are not just being used for food; they're being used for lots of uses. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So there are 7 uses of food. So which I will mention that. But first of all, also remember there's a lot of food wastage. So like almost half the food is wasted. So just don't waste food, and everybody will get enough food. But I've been working on this for 10 years, and I have not seen the numbers go down so much. I mean, there is a lot of grassroots efforts to do that, like from the bakeries and the grocery stores, not to throw away the bread and then provide it, but then it bumps up against agency. But this is, again, just the United States, and I want you to think about the whole world. When you want to think about the whole world, where is the food really wasted? It is wasted after harvest. And it is also wasted because some rat came and ate up the food. Or it was stored somewhere, rain fell, and the grains got washed away or got spoiled. So it's a very complicated problem. I read one time there were like 2 billion farmers in the world, and this massive ship, which is floating, 2 billion people are harvesting crops, and we have to somehow navigate that 2 billion and then the consumers, which is the other like 5 billion. And as Valentine said, most of the undernourished people are farmers themselves. And it's true all across the world. Most of the hungry people are themselves farmers. And it's a highly complicated problem. And you just keep collecting data and you try to do the best that we can. But the solution probably is like make the connection from this dispassionate science data to like the human aspect. And then maybe there will be change.
Well, first I want to say, just a reminder, like feel free to ask each other questions too. So don't let me dominate if you want to jump in. But I was going to turn to you and say like, okay, so we've got this calorie counting system, but what are we missing if that's what we're counting? What are we missing in these hidden food systems that you've already talked about some of this?
I was just desperately looking up some names here. So Minnesota people, you're going to have to help me here. Ansel Keys. So University of Minnesota has a particular history with the calorie because, and there's a great, Nick Cullither has a lovely article called something about the history of the calorie. And the calorie was something people were obsessively interested in measuring because of a labor management question. Like, what are the number of calories that someone needs to, like the bare minimum of the calories someone needs to remain in factory work, fundamentally was the kind of Cliff Notes version of this. So there were all these experiments here at the university locking people in rooms and measuring their heat loss and, under various conditions. So and I think it's worth naming that because it reminds us what the history of states' interest in providing caloric adequacy is, and it's often talked about that as like adequacy, like can people still work, not can they necessarily thrive. So, and in the US, as Deepak mentioned, it's really moving in a way, the definitions you see of food security are really asking like what do people need in order to thrive and have an active life. So we are trying to move a bit beyond that. But I think a flip side of that, and these are some of the names I can't find, but I'm happy to talk to people after if you're interested in this. There's a research group that they're mostly anthropologists and geographers working around the world trying to ask the question, and also people in education, what keeps agriculturalists intergenerationally engaged in agriculture? Because we have this image that people flee agriculture and that as soon as people are able to leave. And it turns out that's only true if your conditions suck. I mean, this isn't terribly surprising, but that like globally, if you have access to decent land and living life as a farmer is good, there's actually much more of a strong tendency of people to want to remain in those lives because it's interesting, varied work that has a lot of reward to it. And I think we see this with a surge in the US of young people who would like to go into farming but can't access land. So I think that it's partly to bringing the human into the data in a way of saying, if we can say what are the conditions of adequacy or thriving, and whether they are caloric or like caloric plus the needed micronutrients, there are ways to measure this that then can allow us to say, okay, our assumptions maybe need to be tweaked a little.
So I mean, you've outlined like sort of the complexities in just getting to this stage. Like it strikes me as someone who's built data sets in the past that you're getting to this point where it'd be pretty hard to go another level in. It's an order of magnitude greater. It seems to me as like how would you possibly ever get to there? And so like, what would it take to get further, or are we at the point where we're sort of like, this is the limit of this approach, and we need to supplement this approach with something else? Or what would, if you had infinite money, what would the version 2.0 or 3.0 of your data set be? So
incredibly, like the growth of the internet has been extremely kind to me. So 10, even 20 years back when there was no internet, countries would keep their data on sheets of paper. And that is the problem still in many countries which are poor. And if I had infinite money, I would buy a plane or charter a plane and fly to many countries of the world, give them the money and get the data, and then hire a whole bunch of students and postdocs, etc., who will digitize the data. But over time, what has happened is countries have started to put up their data online in their own data servers. So the problem has become less difficult. As time goes on, it gets less and less difficult. But then on the flip side, old data is being thrown away. And if you want to do a very long time analysis of like how food security is changing, climate change is impacting, or crop yield trends or yield gaps or whatever else you want to study with agriculture around the world, those data is gone. So my friend who is in Denmark, he tells me the story. He went to Moscow to get to look at the Russian Federation data, and he saw out on the street whole bunch of books, old dusty books with old data, and they were ready to be thrown into the landfill. And then that was probably the last time anybody had the data, and now it is gone forever. Whoever has it, has it. Now that's it, end of story. So that is also happening at the same time. Old ones are going away, but the new ones are getting much more easy to access. And there's a whole host of efforts to make it show. Because if you can't measure anything, then how will you do anything about it? So my whole point is, the reason why I put in so much of effort to develop high resolution data, and yes, we can go to the sub-county level in some countries too, because they have such good data. And I can tell you, there are a handful of countries around the world with very good data. All students, everybody can access it, and with a little bit of effort. United States, very good data. Brazil, very good data, that's it. And then European Union, you struggle with all types of divisions and breakups and everything.
So can I ask a follow-up? Because, when I think about in that, the drawdown framework, like the 100 things we can do to draw down carbon dioxide, so many of the top 10 things are moving us toward a more complex agroecosystem, like agroforestry and mixed crops. Is there a data problem with, like if you have a parcel of land, I assume that we now have the computing skill to handle data that says off of this parcel we get these 50 different crops. Like does that make, I know it makes things harder, but does it make them impossible in this scenario in which we had a lot of funding?
Well, and is your question, is it a data problem, or is it a sensing problem, or a reporting problem?
Yeah, I'm just
or
curious,
like,
where is the problem there? Because we know, like everything we know is that that would be a more climate resilient agriculture, but I feel like we don't do it because we don't have insurance for that, because we don't have the data to back up the insurance.
So you're talking about this complex agricultural land, which is most of like Europe, Africa, Asia. United States is blessed with monoculture, just corn everywhere. So
it's a hashtag for somebody blessed with monoculture.
so it's the remote sensing part, etc. Gets easier, and a lot of scientists have worked very hard to detect corn in the US, but they tell them to detect it in like China or sub-Saharan Africa, and it all falls apart. Because each pixel, so you have the radiation, the sunlight fell on the ground, and there is that sunlight throwing light from all across, and you have a satellite in one direction, which is receiving it, okay? So you have corn, you have also some tree crop, because you need to, if you don't have some production, you're going to die. That's in like the poor farmers. So you have multiple crops, all of them scattering out photons, and that is being received by the satellite. How do you separate them all? Only if you can separate them, then you can detect the crop. So that's why I say United States is blessed with monoculture. Brazil has adopted it very well. And now you can detect where is the corn and where is the soybean relatively. And so there are lots of publications from that.
Well, so this raises like two contradictions. One is that like it's a lot easier to measure something that may not actually be the best for the world in terms of climate sustainability. But also there's a contradiction where like, does it do us any good to have the best data in the places with the fewest food security problems? Like really, don't we want better data in the parts of the world that we have no data for?
Is the biggest conundrum. Like, I can do a very good job for United States in all my calculations, but what is really required is sub-Saharan Africa and Asian countries where the data is just a pain. It's very, very, I'll tell you, like I spent like 10 years or so trying to figure out where is maize grown in Zimbabwe or wheat is grown. And I had no idea until like 2-3 months ago when finally I managed to crack that nut. So that is how long it takes. So I could have solved it if there was unlimited funding, but then it's like I mean, who is going to pay for so much of data gathering? So that's another problem. Scientific funding structure is set up to answer very nice and very cool science question. Everybody wants to do that. I also want to do that. Everybody wants to do that. But then to do that science, you need to do that infrastructure part, the data part. And often you have to struggle to get that data part into your proposal and then hope that they somehow work, but nobody will fund just the data part. So that kind of leaves us like, we want to, yeah, I think I made my point. I don't
Well, and I think it's worth noting that even fewer people will fund the like metadata critique part. Like nobody wants to say, hey, the places we're having trouble are also the places where we built the trains to all go like export stuff to the coasts and not to be infrastructure for the people who live there, which those chickens have come to roost or not. But like you always have to have a solution to be able to be funding. And so some of these wicked problems, when they don't have solutions that come with them, they get relegated into the problems we would rather not know about.
Well, I think to this point, I think like I'd love to. You mentioned earlier like some reasons why a farmer or just anybody might not want to put their data about their food on the grid. You mentioned like exposing it to taxes or like liability insurance. Can you talk through some other reasons, like what might be the consequences for people whose food is not currently sort of on this global grid? And like good and bad, I think like what would be the benefits of knowing more about it, but also like what could go wrong in that, in addition to what you've already discussed?
Right. Well, on footnote, Bill Moseley here, there was a fabulous talk, and so a series of talks at the Institute for Advanced Study maybe 10 years ago about agroecological extension, particularly from Taiwan in the height of the Cold War, trying to bring agroecological methods, partly when they were trying to kind of build up more autonomy. And it was super interesting because it was at a moment of peer-to-peer farmer education, and they just put a lot of work trying to build up more standing in the UN, for example, like to be seen as an exporter of this knowledge, and it was not super successful. But so I think that's one of the main things that would stand to gain is having people able to better mesh the traditional ecological knowledge that has managed to have people stay in these places for thousands of years in many cases with the current population and climate demands of those places. I think one of the big risks in most of these places is land grabs. I mean, really, like bluntly. So I think when you look, and this has started to show up in my social media even this year, like invest in land. And if you click there, it's always like, if we took this land and put an appropriate amount of agrochemicals, we could produce so much more than the people who are there. Therefore, it justifies taking land away from people who need it to survive. And I mean, that's like a very neat characterization of this, which is obviously a messy problem, and there are no great answers for it. But I think fundamentally understanding that the pressure of, especially with the specter of food insecurity and climate change, I mean, when I was looking at your maps, the number of those places that are also farming with fossil water is terrifying.
I don't know, what's fossil water? I
Like
don't know what
people
fossil
are
water is.
pumping up water from aquifers that don't refill.
Ah, okay.
So that, which is like a, you know, and this, you know, I went to, one of the most interesting things that happened when I went to a college reunion is I have a lot of colleagues from college who work as researchers at investment firms, and they were like, Valentine, do you understand how much of world investment is in farmland that has no future? And I was fascinated to hear that. They're like, no one will listen to us about this, but this is like a kind of dirty secret behind a lot of these investments that, yes, and I think this kind of points back to part of like something that's subtle for people who aren't agronomists. When you get these crop yield peaks, that, you know, people see that rise and they map economic expectations onto that rise. Like, you know, we could get a little bit more out of this by putting fertilizer in. And I just think that that circuit of agricultural investments in inputs has driven so much of what we know about agriculture. And even the Farm Bureau is largely invested in input companies at this point. So they are one of the biggest representatives of farming and farm information. They have a huge food literacy website. But but at the end of the day, the interest there is in selling agricultural inputs. It's not really in like the science or social policy of feeding people.
So Deepak, like, well, this is for both of you actually. So I work for Mapping Prejudice. We transcribe racial housing covenants, and that's powered by like crowdsourcing work and like lots of volunteers. We could not do our work without those volunteers. It's also powered by this code and this infrastructure that we've needed to build up, and it benefits from the resources of this large university where we have time to develop things. We have coding expertise, and they will pay my salary. And I think like that's similar to a lot of where some of this data comes from, and where lots of forms of study come from. But and so I think like my question is, are universities optimized to make this data that we are creating truly accessible and actually useful to the full public? And is there equity in who gets to benefit from the data that we create? We think about this a lot. Is like who is the data that we're creating at Mapping Prejudice for? And I think like I think the same question should be asked here. Is like is there equity in who gets to benefit from these data sets that we're creating now?
Well, I'm actually quite fortunate that I work at the University of Minnesota because it has an amazing library and also our interlibrary loan system. So when I want some data and I figure out what is that source, I can often tell the interlibrary loan people, and I don't know, somehow they manage to get whatever I need. So that's kind of amazing. It always blows me away. Also, our Wilson library has many different sections. Like if you go to the basement level 2 and you take a left turn, you get the South Asia and Southeast Asia library. And you have stacks of census and statistics, more than you can ever want. And you can use it. And you won't believe it, most of the universities of the United States don't have that. And rest of the world, no, they don't have that. So this is like a very, I mean to say, this is an amazing library system that we have, which helps us get the data. So I think that answers your question of like, where do I get the data from? And is it accessible to everybody? Yes, it is. I mean, a library is open to everybody. It's accessible to everybody from that perspective. But then what I do with the data is then scientific research. And then the output is often I try to publish in the open access format so that everybody can read it. It does cost a lot. Everybody knows that, those who publish in open access. It's an astronomical price that we have to pay, and they make so much a profit. I'm very unhappy with that system. But we nevertheless have to do that to make it open access, because the answers that I'm trying to find is aimed for somebody in sub-Saharan Africa to be able to read, because they don't have that research infrastructure to build that. So in our Institute on the Environment, we kind of try to make that effort. And University of Minnesota also tries to make a lot of effort so that it becomes accessible. Because governments in all these places, all these analysis of like, what is the effect of climate change on crop yields? They cannot do that in these countries. So it can be done over here, but they need to read it there.
I just want to underline something that you both brought up. That is, I think you sketched out what we would call in the US like an extension role of land-grant universities. And I think especially given the debts that we have acknowledged about the land grant and where that came from, which is the sale at a great profit of indigenous land.
Great plug for our next Spotlight
Right,
series, by
yes,
the way.
And I think, do you want to say something about the next Spotlight
Oh,
from
no,
that
no,
moment?
no,
Okay, we could say this at the end.
Yeah.
I think that the data being there, I can say this partly because I'm not a University of Minnesota employee, but I benefit tremendously from these open resources. I think the extension role is partly, like for example, in Mapping Prejudice, a piece of what is valuable to those volunteers is that you're creating a data literacy and a capacity to navigate these records that people may not otherwise know. And similarly, in bringing these data into easily visualized ways or easy to see ways. I know the visualization itself is not an easy process. I think that's part of what we need more of is that active public education and recruitment. And I think one of the ways that will make universities more equitable as a data space is when we can perhaps work across the different niches of the academic ecosystem. So I spend a lot of time with students, for example, who work at Bethel and Hamline and McAllister and St. Thomas, as well as the U. And spaces like Hecua that brought those students together are wildly valuable because they help reduce the biases that people have. When I did work at the U, farmers would come and say, you misled us. You, University of Minnesota and all of its representatives, led us down the ethanol path. And there are particular institutional injuries that we end up having to address and to rehabilitate. And I think as an aggregate or an ecosystem, we have a lot more space to say our role in society is as a learning space. So in contrast to governments or NGOs, people expect us to mess up, and part of the resources that we allocate are to be wrong. Like that's part of what science is about, is to be able to investigate things and to be able to recover from that with repetition and replication. And I think that to be able to say, I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to policymakers and say, come to the university, workshop an idea, let us like bring in our modeling resources and our historical resources and say like, where are the good and bad parts of this idea likely before you try it out on people. And I think more people should avail themselves of these learning spaces in our societies because the problems we're encountering are going to require much more of a learning mindset than we might be accustomed to.
All right, well, thank you both so much. We're going to transition to some audience questions now and keep them coming. We got some good ones here. So, yep, QR code's up there. So here's a wide open and a big one. How do we, and this is sort of what we're talking about overall, but like, let's see if we can answer this directly. Like, how do we balance the fight against hunger with the idea of supporting local sustainability when mass ag theoretically can be more efficient? So like, what are the, how do we make those decisions?
I have a good example. So there's a USDA grant that's currently out. It's really unusual. The National Institute for Food and Agriculture has done this once before, and that funded the Food Dignity Project, which for those of you interested is fabulous. And it's basically acknowledging it's $5 to $8 million, including for land access for people who haven't had it for community food. And there's a focus saying we recognize that a lot of what's happening in people feeding each other is being led by BIPOC farmers who don't necessarily get the technical assistance funding that usually this money goes out and it gets filtered through white NGOs who have captured expertise. And I think that's a real risk also in universities, and especially around food. There's this sense that the expertise around nutrition and agriculture should live with people with PhDs. And what that leads to is this is a real chip like against food sovereignty and food security, is it means most people's access to knowledge about like their soil or what inputs would be valuable are from their input suppliers. And that's a problem. Like that's one of, so those two things, like basically this grant is a great example where they're saying, we want the majority of this funding to not have to go through the accountability structure of a million layers of government. We want you in each region to locate people who are already doing this well and fund what they're already doing to be the leaders in this. And I think in every place in the world, that could be done better.
You want to talk about how do we balance the, I don't know, do you have thoughts or? Now I gotta scroll back up. How to balance like productivity, the productivity mindset, the efficiency of big agriculture with, with food security.
Yeah, so like, do you know what is the efficiency of beef production? If you have 100 calories given to beef cow, how many calories you will get back? 5. And for chicken, it's like maybe 30 back. So that is the efficiency. And now the issue of big agriculture and food security. So there's this agency part, right? And people want to show that they have made progress in their life. So how does a poor person show that they have made progress in life? By eating like an American. So the world actually is going in that direction, and irrespective of whatever we try, and vegetarian food, etc., in the vast majority of the world, like the next frontier for meat eating is actually sub-Saharan Africa. It's a place with lots of food insecurity, but that is where the consumption of chicken and other meat is ramping up the fastest in the world. That's the new frontier. So how do you have so much of meat unless you have industrial agriculture? So it's like a society problem. I mean, I hope Valentine and others can talk about that more. But from a data perspective, that is what I see is happening all across the world. People are changing the diet, and I think they change their diet to more and more calorie intense diet. So like in the United States, you don't need to harvest so many calories. You harvest like excessive calories. You harvest calories like 4,000 or 5,000 kilocalories per person. Nobody eats 4,000 or 5,000 kilocalories. You still eat 2,400 because the rest is lost. So if you want to have the Western or the American diet, then you need to harvest so many calories. Otherwise, how will you produce so much industrial level of eggs and chicken and meat? Just like if you look at the curve of like how much, so India is well known as like a vegetarian country, apparently. But in 50 years ago, the per capita consumption of chicken in India was just like 200 grams, less than a pound, less than half a pound, or like half a pound. And now it is more than 1 kilograms. And remember, the population has grown tremendously. So the ramping up of eating is tremendous. But then when you look at China, so if India went like this, then if you add China's graph, it is on the floor, and China is here. But then you add United States, the China is on the floor. United States is over there. That is how much meat consumption takes place, and you cannot have it without big industrial agriculture. And it is a society issue. Should we even have that? That is why I want to have the conversation with Valentine.
Well, and I think I'm really conscious of the equity issues involved globally to just say, okay, now that we've already created this model, let's suddenly not allow people to have these externalities that they don't pay for. Nonetheless, I think it's a really valuable conversation to have. Like when we think about industrial meat, these social and environmental externalities make that efficiency even lower. Like the amount that we then have to pay to clean up the water and to try to hold on to the soil, and the speed with which we go through the workers who are on lines that all deunionized in Minnesota, and they're mostly undocumented workers who are treated really, really badly and have repetitive stress injuries pretty much right away. So if we better legislated, that would help a little bit. And then I think one of the other sides of this also is about power, is if we incentivize that more complex kind of agriculture where people are feeding each other, which right now is not only disincentivized, people have to do this in addition to their 3 jobs. I mean, a lot of the people who work in these chicken and poultry processing plants then have a garden that they then have problems with the zoning enforcers on because they're not doing something that's like the American lawn. So, and we talked about this a little bit in the setup. I think it's also worth us acknowledging the amount that the American beef export, and also Brazil and Argentina, I mean, that export, the kind of idea of keeping a certain kind of settler agriculture in business, there was an immense amount of investment in demasculinizing lentils, for example, and saying, real men eat beef in India. And you think, why are these still the people who run the Department of Agriculture? That is a question that should be asked more often. Because when sustainability got built into the new metrics of what diet should be, the Department of Agriculture said, don't be children. They literally said, don't be children. You can't expect sustainability to be something we think of with diet. As if we don't need to eat in the future.
So I've got a couple questions that want to know a little bit more about sort of your methodology, like the inputs that are going in, like what are you actually tracking? And then like, look, we're trying to get to 2030 with like, there's so many uncertainties about how to project that. Like, how do you factor that? Like, what's factoring into your projections?
So what goes on into building the data set? So I track just like the crop production information. So harvested area and crop production, or if you have the yield, then you have the yield and the harvested area for every crop. And Iowa, amazing state. Every year, Iowa's corn yield keeps going up. It still mesmerizes me. It's like, how is that possible? But it is happening every year. So similarly, in all across the world, at that 20,000 jurisdictions, I try to track like what is happening to the yield each year, and I keep doing that for like 50 years. And then That is the foundational data set. So that is one is the yield. The other is known as the harvested area. So how many acres or how many hectares do you really harvest around for every crop? It's very, that harvested hectare is really farmer driven. So and it is very difficult to model, very difficult to understand, because why a farmer planted and then harvested 100 acres versus the next year 1,000. It's all these social questions which I don't have a good handle on. It's a very hard and tricky problem. Yield, however, is a little bit easier to handle because yield keeps going up and down with the weather and the inputs. And inputs blank most of the world. We don't know what is the input. And you may think like we would know like how much nitrogen fertilizer was applied, but actually we don't know for most of the world. And build it down to the small scale, we really don't know how much pesticide, how much insecticide, fungicide, or herbicide added. Even in the United States, it's very hard to understand how much herbicide is used all in every county, because it's all privacy issues. So you have to make estimates. So what is research about like in this area? It's just sitting and trying to understand the data and to collect some data and then model the data and try to break it up into different units, state level to county level to small grid cells. So that's all that people like us do all the time. And then you can ask the science question. And nobody wants to do the previous one. Everybody wants to just start with the science question.
Can I add two things to that? So the Soil Care Network, there's this great group of scientists who are really interested in this question of soil care. How do we relate to soil? And one of the things a lot of them are now studying, so this is kind of a cutting edge of technology in this area, is the microbial DNA of soil. And what is it that's in the soil? So if the inputs are blank, what we know about microbial DNA in agriculture is even more blank. And there's this wonderful kind of emerging field of soil social science where people are asking, sort of as people are waiting for their DNA tests of their soil, like, what do you think is in there? What do you hope is in there? And how are you going to respond to knowing more about this? And I think this is an area that there should be a lot more of, because also awesome about Iowa is every year they ask their farmers what they want to do, and 70% of their farmers every year say they don't want to be growing corn and soybeans only. That although they're good at it and better at it than anywhere else in the world, they know how to grow more things, and they recognize that resilience and interest and the ability to keep kids in their communities and to have the kinds of environments they want to live in would be better if they still grew rotations of oats and lentils and flax and livestock and trees. And so I think kind of coming back to like some of the things we would love to see is more support for that agronomic complexity, including what people would like to be farming.
Well, to that end, what are your wildest visions or dreams of like what would the future of ag and food security could look like or feel like? So maybe one way to ask that is, what's the biggest thing that needs to change? So Deepak.
Well, I think the diversity of the crops is something that I would like to see happening. Like we used to, like all across the world, grow so many different kinds of crops. Like one of the things, like closely studied, sorghum, barley, just has vanished. And rapidly oats, rapidly vanishing. People not growing them anymore. And if you think about like the good things for health, you should have like millets. And millets have iron and zinc. But people in, say, Asia and other places are having what? Rice, just carbohydrate. And leading to the diabetes, lots of diabetes. Eating too much of meat, for example, red meat. So like a more balanced diet. And that balanced diet can be supported if the thing grows. If you grow that thing, and there is an incentive for people to have that kind of food. But the whole power system, I think, in the world, is like Valentine was saying, it's controlling corn, soybean in the US, rice lobby in India, maybe the wheat lobby in Australia, and some other lobbies in China. And there are lobbies, there are entrenched interests, which will not let you get out of that system, and you're locked into it. So if you want to about the future and food security, well, I mean, somehow navigate that. I don't want to destroy, I am not calling for like the people who are good in growing corn and soybean and the whole supply chain down to ethanol. They have their livelihoods. There is some justice has to be maintained for them also, because they have built a livelihood on that. But somehow you can navigate, maybe, I don't know, that's why I want to discuss with Valentine.
Well, and I think you're right. I mean, I think if we could stop allowing these people to control the "we feed the world" narrative, and to say, we recognize that you need livelihoods, and we hear you, Iowa, that this is not the way you want to make your livelihood. How can we make it so that it's different? I think one of the dimensions would be if food were really considered as a basic right. So one of the things that's been really successful in Brazil is those restaurants, the popular restaurants that buy from the farmers who would otherwise be displaced and migrate, they're part of an effort to make sure that everyone has an affordable food floor, so no one falls below a particular diet. And then, there's still a market. Like, food markets are elastic to a degree. I mean, as you said, no one can eat over a certain number of calories, but people buy more foods that are more expensive as they have more income. But what if we could make those, like more exotic kinds of millet? Some of you may remember in the old Bell Museum one year, the Food Sovereignty Prize in Iowa was to the Tamil Nadu Women's Collective. And they won the Food Sovereignty Prize because they started growing kinds of millet that weren't marketable, but were extremely delicious and nutritious. So it meant their household food security wasn't endangered by people selling the crop to buy alcohol or other things. It went to be eaten. So, and there are small things that we're seeing a lot of movement towards. So COVID has meant a lot of schools in the US have gone toward having free lunch for everyone. And they've really worked to say, where can we buy that food from? And how can we make sure that the bus drivers have a part in this? And everyone's job is a little bit better and a little bit less desperate and precarious. And I mean, what would it take to extend that to universities? What would it take to extend that to all public workers? What would it take to extend it to everybody?
Well, we've got like 1 or 2 minutes, so real quick, what's in the policy world? What are you most excited about right now? What's the best thing you've seen happen recently?
I can jump in on this because I mentioned the cluster that was the American Rescue Act problem for farmers. The IRA fixed 80% of those problems. And so through grassroots activism and saying, here's the problem and here are ways to fix it, and listening to those people, change can really be made. So yay, government, you can actually legislate stuff. Keep it up.
In the government and policy world, the importance given to climate-related issues, at greater visibility to that is encouraging a lot, because there are 3 regions of the world where climate change is really having a bad effect. In Europe, in southern African countries, and in Australia. The United States is all a mixed bag, but southern parts of the United States not doing very well from the climate perspective. Minnesota is still okay, because we used to have very cold weather. So the warmer weather actually is helping, but who knows how long that will last. So that's the huge amount of attention given to that is very encouraging.
All right, well, I think we could go on for a very long time, but I think we're going to leave it there. So I just want to thank Valentine and Deepak for all their time and for a really interesting discussion. And thank you all for being here, and thanks for all your great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to more of them, but thank you so much, and hopefully we'll see you at the next Spotlight Series event. So thank you.
Thank you.